In a previous video, we talked about the best Power Rangers weapons, and this got me thinking about the possible weapons we might see in the reboot. We have already talked about the costumes, the stories, and many details about this reboot, but now let's talk about this topic about the weapons. We all know that for superhero stories weapons are very important. Even some weapons can change the course of any story and make a difference in many situations. Because Power Rangers has always been a project for a child audience, the weapons had to be colorful and had certain liberties. Some Power Rangers weapons are ridiculous to adults, but these weapons are possibly the most impressive to kids, and that's because they are somewhat creative. Since the reboot is going to be aimed at a more adult audience, then the weapons are something that should change quite a bit, and not only their design, but also their use. Some weapons look spectacular, but their use is quite unrealistic, like for example the shark sword, which looks spectacular, but its attack is quite crazy. This sword can stretch and travel all over the place to attack many enemies quite fast. This for a children's show is very entertaining, but for an adult show it would be a bit ridiculous. By this I don't mean that Power Rangers is something ridiculous, but that each program has its own style depending on the target audience and how much fantasy they want to give to that project. There are projects that are aimed at an adult audience and have some pretty crazy things that can be almost ridiculous, but that is precisely the style they want to give it. In this case, Power Rangers needs to be a little more serious in the reboot, because in order to be successful it needs to change some things and have a little less silly fantasy. This is the hardest part, as it is quite complicated to identify what can be categorized as silly fantasy and serious fantasy. In the category of weapons, we can identify it in their design and how they are used. Weapons are something quite serious, and I think they could give a power to each one so that they can be something special. This falls under serious fantasy, since a weapon having some special power is still a fantasy. A good example of a weapon that has a special power with a design that is full of fantasy but doesn't go to the extreme of being silly fantasy is Saban, the White Ranger sword from Mighty Morphin. This sword has a tiger head, has a life of its own, and at the same time is still a sword that the Ranger can use to fight like any other sword. Being a sword that he can use in battle gives it the realism it needs to be a serious weapon, but having a tiger head that can talk gives it the necessary fantasy without looking silly. In the comics, this sword is much more special, as it has a great connection to the grid and can identify Rangers from other universes within the multiverse. Many have talked about how the reboot should be like the comics, and it is precisely this kind of thing that makes the comics so spectacular. They can give us enough fantasy without having to get ridiculous, and they stay on the serious side of the story. Some details of the weapons have a lot of similarity with the changes they must make with the costumes, and we all know that the weapons of each Ranger must match the costume. Previously, we had said that the colors of the costume should start to be opaquer, with desaturated colors, and a little darker. This will give a little more seriousness to the project so that it looks like a movie production for adults and not something for a child audience. Basically, this is the same thing they should do with the weapons, since many of them have bright colors like the Ranger's suit, and this sometimes makes them look like toys. This has been one of the weak points of some seasons, and is that the owners of the franchise have always wanted to sell Power Rangers toys, since that is where they get the most profit. Because of this, they have created weapons that already look like toys, so that when they make the real toys, then they look much more like the original object. One of the most iconic seasons in this was Dino Charge, and basically almost everything in that season looks like toys. Another important thing they need to change is utilization, and I'm not just talking about the ridiculous attacks that some weapons have, but also the way a ranger can attack. Because Power Rangers is rated for a child audience, the attacks should be simple and not look like they are taking someone's life. We got to see this change a bit in the special episode when Rocky destroys one of the monsters and uses the sword in a different way, basically trying to stick the sword in his chest. This is something you can't see in a regular season of Power Rangers, and that's why they use small explosions in each attack in order to give it a little bit of impact. Obviously, the new Power Rangers projects are not going to be R-rated, so we are not going to see attacks as gory as we saw in the Logan movie, but we are going to see more violent attacks. For now, the weapons we have seen do not cause visible damage, as the result of each attack cannot be shown as something very graphic but must be something interpretive. This means that when a ranger achieves an attack, then two things can happen: the monster falls to the ground and complains of pain, or it simply explodes and disappears. In a project where the rating is higher, as it is going to be in the reboot, the results of attacks can be different and much more graphical. For example, some attacks may cause the monster to break a limb, it could also bleed, and they could also have a more graphic death instead of just exploding. Don't get me wrong, I love seeing villains explode and having the background music fill that moment with a super epic feel, but this has no realism to it at all. There are moments in Power Rangers that are weird regarding this, as sometimes the monster is talking as if nothing happened and then explodes without having felt anything prior to the attack. An example of this was when Tariq attacked a monster, and the monster hadn't realized anything until it exploded. In the style that Power Rangers has, this is a perfect moment since it is comic, epic, and exaggerated, but in the style that the reboot might have, this would not work. In order to understand all this, you must think that the reboot can have the same style that the 2017 movie has, which was more realistic, and its fantasy did not reach the ridiculous. The story mixes all the reality with fantasy in order to create a fictional world, but with the seriousness of everyday life. Looking at it from that perspective, then imagine a ranger attacking a monster and the monster doesn't notice anything, but 2 seconds later it explodes. This is something that would be ridiculous in a style like this from the 2017 movie, and that's why the weapons should change to have a serious design with more realistic attacks, but full of serious fantasy. Write in the comments the types of weapons you would like to see in the reboot and what power they should have. Like this video and subscribe for more serious Power Rangers fantasy.